A Critique of Occam's Razor. Introduction. William of Ockham was a Franciscan theologian and philosopher who lived from the late 13th to the mid-14th century. Today he is most well known for his use of what we call Occam's razor. This is a principle of theory and hypothesis construction, according to which, when a problem arises, the explanations that need fewer entities or fewer kinds of entities are to be preferred to the explanation that posit more when all evidence remains equal. The theory itself existed before William of Ockham. The creator of this principle was a French bishop named Durantus of Saint-Pourçain, a man who became known for opposing the ideas of Saint Thomas Aquinas. Isaac Newton also restated his version of Occam's razor in his book Principia Mathematica, where he wrote, "We are to admit no more causes on natural things than such as are both true and sufficient to explain their appearances." Or to put it in plain terms, when all evidence is equal, the hypothesis with the smallest number of assumptions is usually the correct one. William of Ockham has become the main name associated with the principle because of the many ways in which he implemented it, and his famous quote, "Pluralitas non est potenta sine necessitate," which translates to "plurality should not be posited without necessity." This idea has become extremely popular and is one of the central presuppositions in scientific thinking, especially in the research of molecular biology. It helps us choose more reasonable explanations than others and prevents us from going down the rabbit hole of skepticism. However, it is my firm belief that although Occam's razor may be helpful in many cases, when trying to solve problems in a reasonable manner, I do not find it to be the way towards truth. It is analogous to the tools that a builder uses, in the following sense. Any heavy object with a flat surface could be used as a hammer, and have a good result. But that doesn't mean that this object is an actual hammer. Just because a method can help us find certain truths to a certain extent, doesn't mean that the method itself is the method of finding the truth. To explain my position, I will divide it into 7 parts. Part 1. Examples and application of Occam's razor. If I told you that there is someone who is constantly following you behind your back, and who is disappearing every time you turn around to see him, would you believe me? Of course not. Because this is where Occam's razor comes in. When I make this hypothesis to you, you then have 2 possible explanations. Either someone is always behind you or not. And since I can eradicate all possible evidence by making this someone having some supernatural ability, you would have no way of proving that there isn't someone behind you. I can always say, why not? And you would have no answer, since you have no evidence of this person's non-existence. So then, by using Occam's razor, you say, well, when 2 answers have equal evidence, I choose the simplest one. Thus, it is philosophically wrong to believe that someone is constantly following you from behind and disappearing whenever you try to look. Here we can clearly see how useful Occam's razor can be. If you see someone get hit by a car, and then that someone starts to scream, you infer that he is screaming because he is in pain, and that is because it is the simplest answer. If I said that someone is forcing that person to scream just to make you think that he is in pain, you would call me a madman, because no rational being would think like that. And so, these are a few examples that show the usefulness of Occam's razor in our application of logical reasoning. But now it is time to start thinking about the problems of this principle and why I think it isn't the hammer, but the mere object that is trying to replace it. Part 2. The Relativity of Simplicity. What makes something simple? This question may seem easy at first, but if one were to really think about it, it would become difficult really fast. Is it that which needs the least number of variables? Not quite, because in some cases, even in most I would suggest, the simple answer has more variety than the complex one. For example, if one asks, why does 3 plus 6 equal 9? The simplest and correct answer would be because if you put 3 things next to 6 other things, you would have a total of 9 things. However, there are many answers with less variety. One could say, well, because my mathematician said so. Now, when we compare these two answers in terms of simplicity, the problem becomes obvious. We can't simply count the variables and choose objectively which is the simplest, because those answers use a different kind of variable. On the one hand, you have the rules of mathematics, which are dictated by the rules of logic, while on the other, you have the assurance of authority. The same problem arises when we are talking about religious subjects. What is simpler, there being a god or not? On the one hand, one could say that the idea of one omniscient, omnipotent existence solves many mysteries about physics, metaphysics, and other philosophical issues, and thus provides a simple solution. On the other hand, however, one could say that God is infinitely complex due to his very nature. So, who is right? Well, I can't say. It depends on the way you look at it. And that is the everlasting problem with the idea of simplicity. I can tell you which arguments sound more sound to me, but I cannot explain which of them is supposed to be simpler. Part 3. The problem of evidence and empiricism. Occam's razor is specifically designed to fit into a pragmatistic, empirical view of reality. Why? Well, because it makes no effort to evaluate the validity of a claim that is not provable by sufficient evidence, other than saying, just pick the simplest of the bunch. It assumes simplicity to be the only way of distinguishing ideas with equal proof, when in practice this is very rarely the case. For example, if one's car starts making weird noises, one will probably interpret it in quite a simplistic way, because one would have a basic understanding of how a car works. But if this were to happen to a car mechanic, his mind would instantly be filled with a multitude of possible explanations. And due to his experience and his talent, he would have a better intuitive understanding of which explanation is the most probable for that specific sound, compared to what a regular person would. And in most cases, his evaluation of the possibilities would be correct, given that he is a good mechanic. So here we see that even with the same amount of evidence, i.e. the weird sounds, different people come to different explanation, and that in many cases the more complex ones are closer to the truth than the simpler ones. Thus, Occam's razor cannot be the best way of determining which ideas depict truth and which aren't. But let me apply the example of the car mechanic in a different way. A more humanistic way. Think about a psychologist. Now, let's say someone calls the psychologist on the phone and starts to talk to him. The evidence about the other person's behavior is in his words and his way of speaking. But because the psychologist has a very good understanding of human behavior, he would be able to create ideas about what the other person is like that no regular person would. So you see, other than the evaluation assumption, Occam's razor also makes another important error. It assumes that everyone who views a problem and its evidence is able to see the same kind of explanations. It assumes that the reasoning process and the intuition of a person are insignificant to the correctness of his theories. This is of course a ridiculous claim, because people have different intellectual capacities and different experiences in life. But Occam's razor is anti-intellectual, in the sense that it simply picks the simplest answer without giving any thought to the kind of person who proposes it, or at least to the reasoning he uses. But we all know that in the case of the psychologist, of course, he would come up with better explanations, and more explanations than the regular person. And we also know that he would have been better at choosing the most probable answer of these. And many of these answers would be a lot more complex than the ones that the regular person would pick. But that's the point. That's why he's a damn psychologist. Even a toddler can pick the simplest answer, but only a psychologist can pick the most realistic one. And since we are philosophers, let's see how the argument affects philosophy. Using Occam's razor would be extremely dangerous when it comes to ontology. Let's take someone like Hegel, Wittgenstein, or Nietzsche, or any of the big philosophers. These people were real geniuses, and not only that, but they used their intellectual capacity to solve philosophical issues. So, in an ontological question, where the evidence we have is quite limited, these people's views had a lot more depth than those of regular folks. And of course, that doesn't mean that they are all correct, but it does mean that using Occam's razor to battle their arguments is irrational. Instead, one has to account for the soundness of their arguments, not merely their simplicity. Especially when it comes to choosing between explanations with equal evidence, because that's where the very thing that we call reason or intellect comes in. In short, the most probable answer to a problem is the soundest one, not the simplest. And not everyone is equally good at being sound in his reasoning.